Now that the world is globalized, I think our perspectives of conflict need to become more sophisticated, whereas previously, territory, in general, was the resource at stake and still is for a reducing list of nations. Instead, today, conflict in general surrounds specific access to specific resources, which requires domestic infrastructure and economy to function, at least to the degree that extraction is economically viable.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Today, the cost of war outpaces its returns, especially in terms of maintaining a war machine, but you can't guarantee trade without either an economically benevolent dictator or a regional/global military stalemate. Any shift in the military status quo makes trade less efficient and more expensive overall. But because nations have to maintain whatever war machine they already have, in order to meet their alliance quotas, non-militaristic economic entities can dedicate much more of their resources towards other enterprises, making them more efficient overall than the governance systems at producing wealth, because they don't have these necessary financial sinkholes.
Completely. The governance system continually tries to develop regulatory checks and balances that inhibits this kind of monopolization, hopefully making it equitably expensive for the entity to be checked, but these entities will always be able to mobilize faster than the checks and balances system. That is because they do not have to singularly pay for the legal, military, and social checks and balances that make trade possible.
Yeah, well, the tax system attempts to proportionally distribute this liability across the economy, but in turn, because these large economic entities are the largest individual contributors to tax, fiscal policy and large corporate policy hold each other hostage. Essentially, the agreement is that the executive authority won't use its military or police force to seize decision-making power and assets from the organization, as long as the executive authority ensures that fiscal policy overall supports the financial interests of these large corporations, whose taxes make the checks and balances possible.
You could also use this thinking to understand why criminal enterprises emerge as antagonists to, and competitors in, the legal system. In these cases, the illicit acquisition and trade of a specific regulated resource produces greater economic returns to a subset of individuals in the enterprise over time than what the legal system can afford to leverage in terms of consequences, given the cost of regulation and maintaining the task force responsible for the policing of that industry.
But similarly to extracting resources in an underdeveloped economy, the illicit trade of specific goods or services on an underground market still requires the underlying infrastructure that makes large-scale trade possible and requires the market pressure of the regulatory system to set initial prices. But here, the underground enterprise does have to pay for the cost of its war machine, and similarly at a certain scale the cost of checks and balances reaches a threshold above which outweighs the benefits for individuals and the enterprise as a whole, so it generally either legitimizes or disintegrates once it crosses that threshold. So, over time this principle applies to legitimate enterprise versus illegitimate enterprise, that is the former is more successful on the bell curve because it outsources the checks and balances to the legal, military, social, and criminal systems and their dynamics. But the minority on either end of any enterprise, legal or otherwise, or an economy as a whole, are increasingly benefited or detrimented by the outsourcing of these checks and balances.
So, are you saying that as an organization, as your checks and balance cost increases, your benefit increases up to a certain threshold, above which it tapers?
Yes. And the inverse too. This is the assumption of this video essay. As you outsource the checks and balances more and more, on the lower end, the relative benefit increases up to a minimum threshold, beyond which it tapers.
But crucially, in order for any organizations to exist and trade efficiently, there needs to be at least a minority of entities that have mostly outsourced their checks and balances at economic detriment to themselves, and entities that have insourced almost all checks and balances, or at least are attempting to, at a detriment to themselves. And then it is friction between these entities, their different checks and balances, and their proportional efficacy, both horizontally and vertically, which shift the distribution of checks and balances, or power over time.